Ravi Paar, a story by Gulzar. The partition of 1947 has influenced the works of an entire generation of writers and continues to do so. Gulzar witnessed the horrors of partition firsthand, and it is a theme that he has gone back to again and again in his writings. Footprints on Zero Line, a collection of his short stories, brings together a collection of his finest writings, fiction, non-fiction, and poems on the subject. What sets it apart from other writings on partition is that Gulzar's unerring eyes does not stop at the events of 1947 but looks at how they continue to affect our lives to this day. Wonderfully rendered in English by well-known author and acclaimed translator of Rakshanda Jalil. This compilation marks 70 years of India's independence. It is not only a brilliant collection on a cataclysmic event in the history of our nation by one of our finest contemporary writers, it is also a timely reminder that those who forget the errors of the past are doomed to repeat them. Reading the contents of footprints on Zero Line in no particular order, perhaps someone will feel as, uh, as I did when I first read this selection, that for Gulzar the partition is not merely an act of severance, a historical event, a historical event located in a certain time and place. For him, it is an opus de profectus, a work in progress. The partition of 1947 seems to rise above its time and circumstance and speaks to him, and not just once or twice, but to borrow a metaphor from cinema as a voice over. This initial impression is reinforced when one takes into account this volume in its entirety. In story after story, Gulzar revisits what has been left behind, sometimes through dreams, sometimes in actual fact, occasionally through a retelling or a remembrance. Sometimes he re-examines the consequences of the partition, consequences that range from the political to the emotional and psychological. And it is in his keen grasp of the consequences of partition that you see the sharp political understanding behind the poet's eye. The old adage of the personal is the political acquires a new meaning when you read a story such as LOC or Saint of Man or a nazm such as Bhameri or Eyes Don't Need a Visa. Poetry, poetry of Gulzar. Let us first look at the poems included in this collection. Here we find ourselves faced with a peculiar dilemma. Should we respond with the head or the heart? In Gulzar's poetry, images are important as content. He cloaks his poetry in a many splendid robe of words, words that have a mesmeric spell of their own. As a reader, and especially a critical reader, uh, you have to wrench yourself away from their insistent inward pull to look again at the image. Once out of the talismanic enchantment, you look at the beauty of the image conjured up by the play upon the words. It shines through the many layers of meaning in all its crystal clarity. crystal clarity, its freshness and poignancy. My experience both as a reader and translator of Gulzar. The translator says Gulzar's poetry tells me that that is when maybe you have reached the core of his poetry. The taste of last year's gur on one's lips, the sight of boys holding watermelons as they float on a river somewhere in the Punjab, the memory of a little boy with a school bag slung from his neck scouring alleys as he searches for pebbles in trains, the haunting loss of a little girl whose hand slips from her mother's as they flee for their lives across a newly demarcated border, the thought of leaving behind a paper boat on the sea at Karachi in the hope that one day when, when the winds change, it will find its way to India. It is images such as these that say far more than any set of words, no matter how beautifully put, ever can. However, since these images are fragile as they are evocative, they are just as difficult to translate. It is a truism much acknowledged that translating any Urdu poetry into English is a task fraught with peril, for quite apart from the differences in literary culture and sensibility, there is also the matter of syntax and natural pauses peculiar to Urdu, but when alien for the English reader, and so more often than not. What is incredibly beautiful and tremulously evocative in the Urdu original can come across as clumsy and pedantic, if not outright banal in its English translation. And when the images, motifs, and symbols are culled from the unity of memories and real lived experiences, they become all the more personal, even in idiosyncratic. The challenge then is to carry the image like a quivering will up the wisp, cross the barrier of one language and attempt to tiptoe into another language and literary culture with at least some of its suggestiveness intact. It may be unfamiliar, even startlingly new to English to startlingly new to the English readers, but that seldom matters. What does is its ability to conjure up a sight that moves both the head and the heart, and that is what Gulzar Sahab does in poem after poem as he takes his reader by the hand and draws them into a world that is highly individualistic and yet welcoming. Dina, the home of his childhood, the home of his childhood, the one he left behind, figures in several poems, as does the experience of going back to Dina, be it through dreams or memories, save for that one time when he actually does go back 70 years after leaving. The closest he can get to describing that experience is through a game he played as a child, Dhaya Chuna, or when a predetermined spot agreed upon by all the children playing the game had to be reached, and the player had to touch that spot, however briefly, before running back. It has taken it has taken me 70 years to return to Dina and touch the Thaya. How much I have run in the wasteland of time, how long I have played, hide and seek. Other bits of flotsam, flotsam and jetsam washed before by the tide of memories find the most poignant expression in the poems chosen here. The rustic joy, a family that a little boy had once tucked in his waistband as he had fled through a dark night, leaving his childhood home forever. The top he had once played with that has been turning ceaselessly in his mind ever since. The creaking sound of a Persian wheel that is still churning our sweetly scented cool water from the innards of the earth. The big girl who had once stolen a lump of clay from his school bag nibbled at it and planted a kiss on the cheek. The wall on which he used to write in Urdu with a piece of charcoal, the little wooden stump he had once thrown on a neem tree laden with plump neem berries, the madrasa school, in the village school where he used to sit on a piece of sacking as he memorized his lessons, and many more sights. Besides, the millstone of time goes around only once, as he tells us in one of his poems, grinding everything fine in that one cycle. Gulzar has poured a lifetime of experiences, memories, dreams, and desires in his grinder. The result is a fine dust of memories that settles over the collection like a sepia tinted particles glimmering with wishfulness and hope. Then there are the images of a child playing hopscotch and jumping over roughly drawn squares on the ground as he crosses the bridge over the Jhelum River in a steam engine and reaches Dina where he Dina where he was born, of going to the border to meet Manto's vision from Toba Tek Singh, who is still standing at no man's land, his feet swollen, his mind unable to comprehend the enormity of his loss, of country paths redolent with damp earth and the moist swings hanging in the rains, of sending a soft breeze with a thousand floral bracelets tied to its wrist as a gift to a friend and a fellow poet across the border, of standing on the zero line with the sun behind him and his shadow and his shadow and his shadow falling forward in of Abu who used to Pakistan of Abu who used to call him Unni, of being made to bend over like a rooster as a punishment by the schoolmaster, of crossing the border time and again with closed eyes for eyes don't need a visa. Eyes not Eyes don't need a visa. Dreams don't have a border. Eyes don't have Eyes don't need a visa. Dreams don't have a border. Gulzar's stories. Coming now to the short stories, here Gulzar comes out of the thicket of memories and allows himself to think with both his head and his heart. The 14 stories included here cover the gamut of the partition experience, from the harsh, brutal reality of the gory events of 1947 to the wars that were fought between India and Pakistan to the communal ill will and mistrust that was bequeathed as a bitter legacy of the Batwara. coming up to the consequences of that ill will that continues to be felt most acutely in the state of Kashmir. Taken together, these stories throw the clearest, strongest light on the long-term consequences of the events that unspooled from 1947. The long shadow of partition has never found such a searing yet a deeply uh, empathetic depiction in the contemporary Indian writing by any living writer. Gulzar differs from the partition generation of writers such as Sadat Hassan Manto and Krishan Chandar in many ways. For one, he has the benefit of hindsight and the luxury of introspection. He is not interested in chronicling the events that led to the division of the subcontinent or putting them in the neat levels of cause and effect or even uh, apportioning blame. Instead, he wants to peel back, lay upon layer, layer upon layer, the silence that had settled upon the lives of those who most affected by partition. And it is this unpeeling of those long held silences that he does in story after story in an attempt to make sense retrospectively of the horrors of the partition. Also, the respite of time allows him to examine not just the gruesome acts of 1947 and its immediate aftermath with some measure of dispassionate inquiry, but also the consequences. 8 or 9 years old at that time, he has had a fairly long time to mull over the memories, to view and review in his mind's eye all that he heard or saw, to go over the experiences of others he heard or overheard, to attempt to understand the narratives of loss and trauma his young mind was unable to process at the time. Time, the greater healer, also lends perspective, and it is his perspective that makes his writings on the partition so different from his predecessors. Crossing the Ravi is short and sharp, relying on its brevity for its sting. With a few deft strokes, it recreates the havoc of those panic-stricken days of mass migration and the terrible human cost of the madness that engulfed ordinary men and women. Two sisters, and extract from a novel tells the story of two sisters brutalized and rendered homeless by the partition, drifting like dried leaves from town to town till they settle down in the place far removed from home and attempt to rebuild their shattered lives only to find the seed of despoiling can only yield a bitter harvest. The subject of raped and abducted women has cropped up in many partition stories. Manto, perhaps, put it best when he asked, whenever I thought of those abducted women and girls, all I could see were swollen, distended bellies. What would happen to these bellies? Who is the owner who lies suffered, stuffed in these bellies? India or Pakistan? And what of the 9 months of labor? Who would pay the wages, India or Pakistan? Or would it all simply be put in the account of cruel nature? Isn't there a blank column somewhere in the ledger, खुदा के लिए मंटो, खुदा के लिए, by Mantu? In Two Sisters, Gulzar Sahab tells us about two such numbers in his blank column. A sweet story about the veteran journalist Kuldeep Nair changes the mood from despondency to hope. It reminds us that the bonds of shared living are stronger than the hurts and betrayals of history and the arbitrary drawing up of boundaries. In over LOC, two soldiers and Rams, two soldiers and Rams Gulzar Sahab takes us to border and again in his characteristically human human manner shows shows us how humanity may be challenged but can seldom be snuffed out totally by larger geopolitical forces. The personal and the real, never far from the surface in much of Gulzar writings on the partition, reappears in partition to testify the lengths people are willing to go to the belief that their loved ones are are merely lost, not gone forever. Make believe is as much a part of copying as mistrust as we find in the next story. Fear, possibly set in the Mumbai of present times, the Mumbai scared by communal riots. This story reminds us of the communal hatred that is as much a legacy of partition as independence, and how it simmers beneath the surface of the normalcy. Hope and faith in the pluralism and syncretism, syncretism the suffuse Gulzar's writing with a luminous glow is missing in a smoke, a dark story. It leaves a question in its trail. Does individual will have no place before the collective will of the mob? Drawing upon his own childhood in the Sabzi Mandi neighborhood of Delhi, the Jamun tree recreates a neighborhood poised on the brink of disaster as the ill winds of communalism tear asunder the social fabric of ordinary lives. The Scent of Man and Search, two of the hardest hitting stories in this collection, are both about Kashmir. Both show how the situation in Kashmir is a consequence of the partition. The stories also reiterate my impression that for Gulzar Saab, the long term effects of the events of 1947 as are a work in progress. He takes no sides and steadfastly refuses to look for heroes and villains. He simply wishes to show the horrific toll of a tragedy of such immense proportion on human dignity. While much ink has been spilled on the political and historical implications of the partition, relatively little has been written on the human aspect of this momentous event in the recent history of South South Asia. Gulzar Sahab corrects this anomaly and with this collection addresses an old wrong in foregrounding the stories of ordinary people, be, be they the foot soldiers who fight the real wars on ground zero, or writers and journalists looking for answers and closer against the hegemonic larger narratives of nationalism and patriotism. He is showing us where the possibilities of healing and redemption might lie with the ordinary people themselves. Ravi Paar is a collection of short stories which do not follow a particular theme but touch upon different human emotions. The stories in this book have their roots in the Indian culture but express universal emotions that are experienced across the boundaries of region, caste, and creed. Varied emotions of love, heartbreak, aloofness, anxiety, fear, and longing are expressed in this book. There is one story in which movie star Dilip Kumar breaks the heart of a young girl. There is another where a man pushes off another from a moving train. Ravi Par also tells the story of a Muslim man whose wish is to be cremated after death and not be buried. There is also a story about a married woman who realizes that the only reason for her husband to marry her was to use her as a cheap labor. The title of this book is an incident from the author's own life. During the Indian Pakistan partition, the author was mistakenly claimed as their own child by another family. Ravi Par consists of stories which will touch the reader's hearts due to the simplicity and intricacy of emotions portrayed by the author. Serious, moving, funny, and ironic by turns, these stories are replete with the perceptions of a man who has viewed the world with equanimity and compassion. It took a long time for Sampuran Singh, Gulzar's original name is Sampuran Singh, whom we all know as Gulzar, to put together a collection of stories on partition. Those tumultuous times continue to haunt him. I haven't yet distanced myself from that, he says. True, for the trauma and the pain comes dramatically alive in the recently published English translation of his stories, Ravi Bar. Like Silences, the English tradition of his poetry published last year, his tragically grand and pathos filled stories translated by Masuma Ali and Alok Bhalla have been getting rave reviews. What I have felt from within, I have written and presented to you, he says. It is as if Gulzar, after all these years, finally mustered the courage to start exorcising all those demons. He talks of his mulk and watan. My mulk, motherland, has been left on the other side. My watan country is here. That is what that is what keeps me forever divided. But he sees hope in man's ability to transcend all such boundaries. Just as India is divided into different states yet remains unified, the people of India and Pakistan are essentially the same. We will cross man made borders and one day, because ultimately we are looking towards unity, he says. The partition of 1947 has influenced the works of an entire generation of writers and continues to do so. Gulzar witnessed the horrors of partition firsthand, and it is a theme that he has gone back to again and again in his writings. The Footprints on Zero Line brings together a collection of his finest writings, fiction, non-fiction, and poems on the subject. So what sets this collection apart from other writings on partition is that Gulzar's unerring eye, unerring eye does not stop at the events of 1947, but looks at how it continues to affect our lives to this day, wonderfully rendered in English by well known author and translator uh, Rakshanda Jalil. This collection marks 70 years of India's independence. Footprints on Zero Line is not only a brilliant collection on a cataclysmic event, it trickles through in Ravi Paar, the story of a Sikh woman who has just delivered twins and is feeling from Pakistan on the roof of a train. One of her children survives, but the mother clasps the dead one to her breast in a purgatorial gesture. Her husband throws the child into the river, exclaiming, Vahe Guru. It is only when he hears a scream that he realizes he has sacrificed not the dead but the living child to the river that was supposed to separate past from present. It is a chilling metaphor for Gulzar's own childhood trauma, and he says, it is I who have been left behind and drowned. Drowned, it is I who have come this side. Gulzar plans to write another book soon. In Batwara, he writes, sometimes life runs leaping like a wounded cheetah and leaves its claw marks here and there. Gulzar, he we knew, has left more than claw marks. Gulzar, the well known poet and lyricist, is also an excellent storyteller. Those who have seen his movies like Ijazat or the more recent Machis would agree that he is a master at storytelling. Ravi Par is a collection of short stories that touch soul like a breeze and leave an impression on our heart like footprints on sand. Gulzar was the only reason I picked up. Simple style and easy to comprehend language are the highlights of Gulzar's stories. There is a strong local flavor in his writing, and the themes are strongly rooted in Indian culture and history. However, the spirit and emotions that are conveyed are universal: fear, love, friendship, loneliness, etc., that are inseparable parts of human consciousness are portrayed through his characters. The characters are easily identifiable and real. There is no sense of the fantastic or unreal, but the situations are too are so lifelike and the human reactions so human that the unreal element creeps in un, uninhibited. Gulzar, the poet, makes his presence felt all the time. There is an easy flow and rhythm to the stories, and they are interlinked not by a character or theme, but with the very fact that the crux of the stories is the human mind. Instead of directly unveiling the political or social truths behind the dramas of life, Gulzar takes the readers into human subconsciousness mind, and the truth then revealed is not limited to one single person. It becomes universal and all encompassing. For those who enjoy the earthly touch, the lyrical mysticism, and the elusive surreal element of Gulzar movies will definitely like the short stories in Raavi Paar, especially the little story which narrates an interesting episode of the author's life. Except for the story, none of the others are autobiographical, enriching and interesting. This book would make a good two or more reading. There are hard-boiled writers who put pen to paper on finger to typewriter keys to churn out paperbacks and yet can also write a couplet or two. And then there are the mellower poets who can write equally enchanting and lyrical lines that short stories or the occasional novels. Sampuran Singh Kalra, or Gulzar as we know him, and easily the finest living poet and lyricist of our times, belongs to the latter category. Latter category. um, as evidenced by his most well-known collection of short stories, Ravi Par and other stories written occasionally in both Hindi and Urdu and translated with reasonable integrity by Masuma Ali and Alok Allah. The titular story would be familiar with almost every fanatic who has devotedly pursued these legend's literary exploits over the years. This heart wrenching personal tragedy set in the anarchy that followed the acrimonious partition demonstrates not only the poet's crystalline clarity and brisk economy of thought, but also his thoughtful, almost mm, melancholic and elegiac lament of the travesty, both grand and intimate, of people's lives and fates decided by forces larger than them. But the other, more eclectic stories in the compilation deserve equal accolade for not only their literary merit but also in the sheer breadth of Gulzar's imagination and insight. Where should one start though? The best thing would be to begin with two stories that serve as exemplary models of his equally iconoclast and markedly intelligent work in the films apart from lyrics. One is the impossible inspiration for the mesmerizing Lekin. Indeed, apart from sharing the same name, the story's themes probing the very meaning of the reality and the time and space bending power of the afterlife and other surreal metaphysical forces find its true manifestation in that elegantly crafted film. The milieu and context might be different in the short story, set in the neglected suburban uh, uh, excrescence of Bombay rather than in the shimmering haze of sands of Rajasthan, but the eventual impact of startle, shock, and wonder is the same. More charmingly, there is Guddo, possibly the rough draft from which Gulzar's in, uh, entertainingly snarky script for Rishikesh Mukherjee's rollicking classic Guddi. The scope in the short story. The scope in the short story is more personal and intimate, gazing at the haplessly star-struck protagonist as her idolization of a screen god goes to unprecedented depths, almost around the pangs, around the amounting the pangs of pubescent sexual jealousy. Again, there is a simplicity on the surface of the premise, but the economy is effective. Not all these eclectic stories in Ravi Par and other stories hit the mark. His own, presumably a tongue in cheek take on Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book is a tattoo, obvious and parodical for one thing, and a few other stories in the ensemble get tangled in their own intricate proceedings, mostly through his writings reeks of the same piquant, homegrown flavor and wry wit that we associate with the songs, poems, and films. So, this way, dear students, I have completed my lecture for the day. My lecture is over.